Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up a really interesting file. It's about one of the most, dramatic professional implosions in recent culinary history. And maybe more importantly, the attempted resurrection years later. We are talking about Paula Deen, a figure who, for a whole generation, pretty much ruled the American kitchen, famous for that warm Southern hospitality and those recipes just loaded with butter. But then, about a decade ago, her huge multi-million-dollar world just came crashing down. She basically vanished from the mainstream. Now, though, she's trying to stage a comeback. There's this new Redemption documentary supposed to give her side of things. So our mission today is a real deep dive. We're going to unpack the sources, figure out exactly how that fall happened so fast, look closely at the specific claims she's making now after all this time, and try to understand why the reaction today feels less like a redemption and more like a cultural reckoning.
Right. And that distinction, reckoning versus redemption, that's really key for you, the listener. This isn't just, oh, a celebrity wants her job back. The sources really frame this whole thing as a kind of cultural litmus test. Can someone fall that fast, that hard, and actually climb back after more than 10 years away? The real question is, are people willing, to let her back in, to give her that cultural permission again?
Okay, let's get into it. We have to rewind back to that summer when it all, detonated. The sources are super clear on the exact trigger for the career collapse. It was that moment during a legal deposition where she admitted it, under oath, admitted using a racial slur.
And the context there is critical. It wasn't like a rumor or some old recording dug up online. No, this was an admission made in a legal setting tied to a lawsuit from a former employee that just amplified everything instantly. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was documented fact.
And the fallout.
Yeah.
Wow, it was just staggering how fast it happened. When we say rapid decline, we mean like a 72-hour professional obliteration. She lost her Food Network deal almost immediately. Huge contract, gone. But that was just the beginning.
Yeah, the analysis really shows how embedded her whole persona was, everywhere. In retail, the sources remind us about the big endorsements. We're talking drug companies, major stores, food brands. They just started dropping her one after the other. So it wasn't only the TV show being canceled. It was this sudden, instant crumbling of a massive brand, decades in the making, built on that specific, warm, trustworthy image.
It's still kind of hard to wrap your head around that level of professional destruction, even looking back. You can lose a show, sure, but for the entire commercial machine behind her to just vanish like that, almost overnight, it really highlights how serious that initial admission was perceived.
And what's fascinating and kind of central to this current moment is that even after she pulled back from the public eye for over 10 years, that original scandal, it never really went away. The sources describe it like this lingering shadow, heavy, still there. And that unresolved history is exactly why this current attempt, this documentary, is getting such intense scrutiny now. She never fully left the cultural memory, just the public stage.
Right. So, okay, enter the new narrative. A decade of relative quiet, and now she steps back out with this documentary. It's explicitly designed, it seems, as her way to try and reclaim that story, finally give her side, as they say.
Exactly. And if you look at the film itself as, a strategic piece of communication, which is how a lot of the analysis is treating it, you see this very clear attempt. It tries to address the original issue by providing context, maybe more than just apology. She puts forward three main defense points in the film. First, she connects using the slur to a really traumatic event from way back. Says she was held at gunpoint in the 1980s. The idea there, sources suggest, is to frame it not as deep-seated prejudice, but as a reaction born from extreme fear decades ago, shifting accountability.
So trying to make it situational, not habitual, tied to that one specific terrifying moment.
Precisely. But the criticism, and you see this in the sources, is that bringing up a trauma from, 40 years ago, it doesn't really explain the admission under oath much later. And it also doesn't quite address the decade of cultural silence on it afterwards. Okay, her second defense point, she claims she was just naive about racism, pleading ignorance over malice, essentially. And the third one, maybe the most controversial strategy, is blaming her legal team, saying they failed her during those initial proceedings, suggesting the whole crisis was mishandled, that she wasn't properly represented when that damaging admission became public.
Okay, that definitely sounds like trying to externalize the blame a bit. Like, okay, I messed up, but the way it blew up wasn't entirely my fault. It was bad advice.
It does feel like that. It's sort of an attempt to relitigate how that whole first week unfolded, suggesting the narrative spun out of her control partly because of others. It casts doubt on the established memory of the fallout.
Now, here's where it gets, really interesting and maybe a bit contradictory. She sums up her whole approach with this key quote in the film. She says, and this is direct, I'm not here to convince y'all I'm not racist. I just want you to hear the whole story and decide. Wait, so the sources are saying her strategy relies on telling people she's not trying to convince them. That feels counterintuitive, like she's aiming for empathy, maybe not necessarily proving innocence.
That exact phrase, yeah, that's become the real flashpoint for this whole public reckoning.
Mm.
By saying she's not trying to convince people she isn't racist, well, she neatly avoids having to actually defend herself fully on those terms. She kind of puts the burden of judgment entirely on the audience. You decide. And the analysis shows critics jumped on that immediately. They argue it comes across as evasive, not really genuine repentance. So, if the goal was full forgiveness, getting back into everyone's good graces, the source material suggests the reaction has been, well, mixed at best, definitely not full forgiveness. A lot of the critical voices are saying the apologies back then and the explanations now, they just don't feel deep enough, not enough to match the original offense and its cultural impact.
Which brings up that big question, doesn't it? Is this whole documentary thing genuine remorse, or is it more like a PR move? A strategy to, test the waters for a comeback, maybe get some streaming views. The sources definitely suggest many observers are leaning towards that second interpretation, calling it a calculated strategy, not real redemption. And that, of course, leads straight to the huge polarization we're seeing play out right now. It's really split. On one side, you've got her diehard fans, people who watched her for years, felt that connection. They say they've missed her, missed that warmth, and they're absolutely ready to welcome her back. They want the Paula they remember.
Yeah, but then you have the other side, the critics. And they're arguing that some wounds, especially those tied to race and long-standing social issues, they don't just heal easily. Or, at minimum, they need a lot more than one self-produced film to even begin addressing them properly. For them, this isn't just about recipes, it's about who gets cultural permission and why. The reporting seems to land somewhere in the middle, suggesting the truth of her motives and how this all ends up is probably complex, somewhere between those two poles. But the debate itself, that intense discussion, that's the reckoning.
Let's tie this back to that key idea you mentioned, her asking the public to decide. The analysis really digs into the tricky nature of public forgiveness, especially using that quote.
Exactly. The critique kind of hinges on this idea of a cultural debt. The sources note that even just asking for forgiveness implies you did something wrong. It admits a problem exists. If you have to ask, you're basically acknowledging there's something you need to be forgiven for. To put it simply, the argument in the source is kind of like, if you have to ask forgiveness, you still owe something, right? And that debt, in Dean's case, is owed to the audience, the culture she offended. So the public is now debating whether this documentary is, sufficient payment for that debt. And the irony is the film meant to possibly save her legacy, bring her back. It's actually, as the source put it, kind of tearing it apart again by forcing this intense new round of scrutiny a decade later.
So, okay, wrapping this up, what does this mean for you, the listener? If we step back, the core conflict is this. Paula Deen wants back into public life, on her terms. She's armed with this carefully constructed narrative meant to explain the past. But the sources are pretty clear. This isn't playing out like a typical celebrity comeback where you just, show up again. It's much more of a cultural reckoning. The public is being pushed to decide if the initial consequences were enough, if this new explanation changes anything. And the big question hanging in the air is, will this documentary finally let her move past that decade-old shadow? Or will the backlash actually end up burying her legacy for good under all this renewed attention?
Yeah, and if we zoom out even further, thinking about celebrity and controlling your story, this whole situation really makes you think about the rules of public forgiveness now, especially online. I mean, if a public figure feels they have to retell a really dramatic personal story from, 40 years ago, like that gunpoint incident in the 80s just to get permission to maybe come back, it raises a really big question about how long that public debt lasts. Is there a statute of limitations on public shame? Or can a narrative, once it shatters like hers did so quickly and so completely, can it ever truly be put back together again, fully reclaimed? So maybe something for you to think about. What stands out to you as the key ingredient for cultural forgiveness today? How are these narratives built, broken, and maybe, just maybe, rebuilt in the modern spotlight?